My daughter pushed me down the stairs in a foreign country to steal my vineyard and left me to die. That is what everyone thinks happened. But what they don't understand is how it all started long before Italy, long before that staircase. Long before I realized my own daughter had already decided I was disposable. Mom, you don't understand modern wine business anymore, Lauren said in front of the entire boardroom as investors laughed softly like I was already irrelevant. She should step aside before she ruins everything. Another voice added. And I remember standing there in my own Napa Valley tasting room watching people I had known for years avoid my eyes like I had already lost. Maybe it's time you let the next generation take control, Lauren said again, her voice calm, polished, rehearsed, and I asked her quietly, is that what you think I am, a problem to be removed? And she didn't even hesitate, she just smiled and said, you're a liability, Mom. And in that moment, something in me went completely still, not anger, not shock, just recognition that I was no longer speaking to the child I raised. And if this story speaks to your heart, if you've ever felt replaced by the very people you sacrificed for, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now where you are. Because I read every single one of them, now let me tell you exactly how it began. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 63 years old, and I own a vineyard in Napa Valley, California. Or at least I used to believe I truly owned it, until the night everything inside my family started shifting in ways I did not immediately understand. And maybe the most important thing you should know about me is that I did not build this place for wealth. I built it after my husband died. After everything in my life collapsed once before and I had to rebuild it with my own hands. I remember the smell of wet soil in early spring mornings, the silence of rows of vines stretching farther than grief could reach, and I remember believing that if I worked hard enough, love would stay anchored in the same ground. Lauren was supposed to inherit this place one day. She grew up between these hills. She ran between barrels when she was small. She used to press her hands into the grapes and laugh like nothing in the world could ever turn cold. But people change when money starts whispering louder than memory. And I should have noticed when she stopped asking me about harvest seasons and started asking me about valuation numbers instead. The first real crack came during a board meeting in our main tasting hall, the kind of room tourists photograph without knowing what decisions are made behind those wooden tables. Lauren sat across from me with investors from Hawthorne Capital, men in expensive suits who spoke about my vineyard like it was a spreadsheet instead of a legacy. We need operational control moving forward, one of them said, sliding papers across the table. And I remember Lauren not looking at me when she said, my mother is emotionally attached to outdated methods. There was a soft laugh around the table, not cruel, just dismissive, the kind of laugh that makes you feel smaller without anyone raising their voice. And I looked at her trying to find even a trace of hesitation in her eyes. But there was none, only certainty, like she had already rehearsed my disappearance from the decision-making process. After the meeting, she walked me outside near the vineyard entrance where the wind moves through the vines like a low breathing sound. You don't have to make this harder than it is, she said, adjusting her coat like she was preparing for a business trip and not dismantling a life. And I asked her, harder for who, Lauren? And she finally looked at me, really looked at me, and said, for you. Because you're standing in the way. That was the first time I felt something unfamiliar in her presence, not just disagreement, but calculation. And still I told myself it was stress, pressure, investors, money, things adults survive through. I did not yet understand that I had already become a problem she needed to solve. A few days later, she invited me to Italy, Tuscany, a vineyard partnership meeting she called it, a chance to expand globally, she said. Her voice warm again like nothing had ever broken between us. It's important you come, Mom. They want to meet you personally, she told me over the phone. And I remember standing in my kitchen in Napa looking out at my own vines as she spoke, and something about her tone felt too smooth, too perfect, like a glass surface hiding depth underneath. I should have trusted that feeling more than I did. On the morning of departure, I met her at the airport, and she was already in control of everything. Tickets, itinerary, driver waiting in Italy, everything arranged with precision that did not feel like love. When we landed in Tuscany, the air was different. Heavy with heat and stone and silence, the vineyard there sat on a hill like a painting meant to impress investors, not families. And the local lawyer arrived later than expected. which Lauren dismissed with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "He's always like this," she said. But I noticed something else. The security cameras near the estate entrance were not active, at least not blinking the way they should. And when I asked about it, she answered too quickly, "Technical issue." Then she changed the subject. That was the moment I should have stopped trusting explanations that came too fast. Because in my experience, the truth never rushes. It waits. And that night, as we walked toward the stone staircase overlooking the lower terraces, Lauren stayed just one step behind me, close enough that I could feel her presence but not see her expression, and she said softly, almost gently, "After this, everything will finally make sense." And I turned to ask her what she meant, but she was already looking past me toward the vineyard lights below, like she was watching a future I had not been invited into. And the air between us felt suddenly unfamiliar, like standing on the edge of something already decided. And that is when I realized there were documents waiting somewhere I had not signed. Decisions already made without me, and a silence in her voice that did not belong to a daughter bringing her mother on a business trip. And as we stood there overlooking the Tuscan Valley, I noticed for the first time that she was not nervous at all, not even a little, and that was the first true warning I could not yet name. I did not sleep that night in Tuscany, not because of fear, but because my mind kept walking backward through time as if it was trying to find the exact moment everything between Lauren and me began to fracture. And the strange thing about memory is that it never starts with the worst moment. It starts with the smallest ones, the ones you almost ignore at the time, like dust in sunlight that only becomes visible when it is too late to clean it. I remember Lauren at 7 years old, standing barefoot in our Napa vineyard, her hands stained purple from crushed grapes, laughing as if the world itself had given her permission to be free, and I remember thinking that nothing in this life could ever turn that joy into distance. But life does not break people all at once. It rewrites them slowly, and I can see that now more clearly than I ever did then. The first shift came when she was 12, and we were sitting in the tasting room during a small local event. A wine distributor from San Francisco was speaking to me about production yields and export limits when Lauren pulled on my sleeve and asked me to come outside. She said, "You are always listening to them instead of me." And I laughed softly because I thought it was a child wanting attention. I said, "Give me 5 minutes, sweetheart." But those 5 minutes became the pattern of our lives without me realizing it. She began watching me more than talking to me after that, studying the way people shook my hand, the way investors leaned closer when I spoke about soil composition and climate cycles. And somewhere in her silence, she began building a different understanding of what mattered. Years later, after her father passed away, I tried to fill the space he left behind. I worked longer hours in the vineyard. I attended every school event I could. I even learned how to cook her favorite meals exactly the way she liked them. But grief has a way of making you believe effort is enough when sometimes presence is what is missing. One evening when she was 16, she came home late from a school event, and I was waiting in the kitchen. I asked her gently, "Where were you, Lauren?" And she dropped her bag on the floor and said, "You are not my whole life, Mom." I remember nodding because I thought she was asserting independence, but now I understand it was the beginning of separation, not freedom. During her college years at Stanford, she changed again. She studied business and finance. She started speaking about vineyard valuation instead of wine, about scalability instead of legacy. I remember one phone call during her sophomore year when she said, "This place could be worth 10 times more if it was managed correctly." And I asked her, "Managed or changed?" And she paused for a second too long before answering. Both. There were other moments too small to alarm me individually but heavy when stacked together. Like when she introduced me to investors and corrected me mid-sentence in front of them, or when she stopped calling the vineyard home and started calling it the asset. I remember one dinner in Napa when she brought a man named Victor, a financial advisor from Los Angeles, and he spent the entire evening talking about market repositioning while barely tasting the food. After he left, Lauren said, "He understands potential," and I said, "And what do you understand?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window toward the vines and said, "I understand what people are willing to pay for things that are not moving fast enough." That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. After that, I noticed something else. She began asking more questions about ownership structure, about trusts, about what would happen if I was no longer able to manage things. I told her once, "You talk like I am already gone," and she replied without looking up from her phone, "Planning is not disrespect, Mom." and I wanted to believe her. I really did. But belief becomes harder when patterns repeat, especially when those patterns begin to feel like quiet preparation instead of concern. There was a moment last winter when I found her in the office late at night going through old property documents. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Organizing things." I asked, "My things or your things?" And she smiled in that controlled way she learned as an adult and said, "There is no difference anymore." And I felt something inside me shift, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make me start keeping copies of everything without telling her. That was the first time I contacted Lucas Reed, my attorney, not because I wanted conflict, but because I began to feel the quiet shape of one forming around me. Lucas told me, "Families do not usually move like this unless there is outside pressure." And I remember asking him, "What kind of pressure?" And he said, "Financial pressure changes loyalty faster than emotion ever could." I did not understand that fully at the time, but I understand it now in a way I wish I never had to. Lying awake in Tuscany, I realized Lauren was not suddenly different on that staircase. She had been changing for years, under layers. I refused to see clearly, and the most painful part was not betrayal itself. It was the memory of every moment I had mistaken for ambition, when it may have already been strategy. I walked outside before dawn that morning, the air cool against my skin, and looked toward the distant outline of the Vineyard property we had come to visit, everything still and quiet like it had no idea what had already been set in motion, and I whispered to myself, not in anger, but in recognition, "How long have you been preparing to leave me behind?" And somewhere deep inside me, I already knew the answer was longer than I wanted to admit, because by the time we arrived in Italy, I was not stepping into a partnership meeting. I was stepping into a plan that had been quietly unfolding long before I ever agreed to travel. I remember the morning after. The air in Tuscany felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because I was finally beginning to see what had always been there beneath the surface. Lauren arrived at the villa before breakfast with two men I had never met before, both wearing tailored suits that looked too heavy for the warmth of the Italian sun. She did not greet me the way a daughter greets her mother. Instead, she placed a folder on the wooden table between us and said, "We need to finalize the operational transition before the investors lose patience." Her voice was calm, but there was no softness left in it, only direction, control, and expectation. I looked at the folder and asked, "What transition are you talking about?" And one of the men answered before she could, "Full management transfer, effective immediately." As if I had already agreed to disappear, I turned to Lauren and said quietly, "You brought me here to sign myself out of my own vineyard?" And she sighed like I was being difficult in a meeting that had already concluded. "Mom, you are emotionally attached to something that requires scale now," she said. And I noticed the way she avoided calling it ours or even yours. It had become an object without belonging, something to be moved, traded, optimized. I opened the folder slowly, and the first page I saw was a revised ownership structure of Collins Vineyards LLC, my name reduced to a minority advisory role I had never approved. I felt my hand pause on the paper, not from shock, but from recognition, because this was not sudden. This was layered, prepared, refined over time. I asked, "Who drafted this?" And Lauren replied, "Legal team aligned with Hawthorne Capital." Then she added, "It is the only way forward." And I looked at her and said, "Forward for who?" And she did not answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back and said, "For everyone who understands business reality." One of the investors stepped closer and added, "Mrs. Collins, you have built something beautiful, but beauty does not always scale." And I remember thinking how easily people replace meaning with numbers when it benefits them. I closed the folder and said, "You are asking me to sign away something my entire life is built on." And Lauren finally looked at me directly, not as a daughter, but as someone measuring resistance. "You already built it," she said. "Now you are preventing it from surviving." There was a silence after that, a heavy one, the kind that does not belong in negotiation but in endings, and I asked her something I did not plan to ask. "When did I become your obstacle instead of your mother?" And for the first time her expression tightened, just slightly, like something inside her had to hold itself together. She said, "When you refused to evolve." And I remember feeling something shift inside me, not anger, but clarity, because evolution is a word people use when they want permission to erase what came before. Later that afternoon, I walked the vineyard paths alone, and I called Lucas Reed from Napa. His voice came through steady as always, and I told him everything, The documents, the investors, the pressure, and when I finished there was a long pause before he said, "They are trying to force a restructuring without proper fiduciary disclosure." And I asked him, "Is it legal?" And he answered, "It is designed to look legal, not to be clean." Those words stayed with me as I stood between rows of vines that had survived droughts, storms, and years of silence, and I began to understand that what Lauren called transition was actually displacement, not just of ownership, but of identity. That evening she returned with more urgency, her tone sharper now, the calm layer beginning to crack. She said, "If you do not sign, the investors will withdraw, and everything will collapse." And I asked her, "Everything, or just your version of it?" And she stepped closer and said, "You are making this emotional." And I replied, "No, I am making it accurate." That was when she said something that stayed in the air longer than the words themselves. "You are not the only one who lost something here." And I looked at her and said, "Then tell me what I took from you." And she hesitated, just for a second too long, and in that hesitation I saw it, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but present, a story I had never been told, a resentment that had been growing in silence long before money entered the equation, and one of the investors, impatient now, said, "We need resolution by tomorrow morning." And Lauren nodded without looking at me, and said, "Then we will get it." And I realized in that moment that the conversation was no longer about agreement, it was about removal. Later that night, I went back to my room and opened my old travel case, and inside, beneath clothing I had not touched yet, I found a copy of a property audit report I had requested months earlier and forgotten in the noise of daily operations. But someone else had not forgotten it, because across the margin there were handwritten notes I did not recognize, referencing transaction timings, offshore advisory consultations, and a legal signature verification request flagged for irregularity. My hand went still as I read the final line, a note that said, "Do not finalize transfer until identity confirmation is resolved." And I whispered into the quiet room, "Identity confirmation?" Because that was not about land, that was about me. And in that moment I understood that the vineyard was not the only thing being targeted. I was, and as I sat there holding the paper under the dim light, I realized something far more dangerous than betrayal had already begun, because someone had been digging into who I was long before I ever arrived in Italy. And the question was no longer whether Lauren would take the vineyard, but what she believed she already knew about me that made her willing to try. I stayed awake long after the villa went quiet, not because I was waiting for morning, but because silence has a way of amplifying thoughts you can no longer avoid. And in that silence, the words from the audit report kept repeating inside my mind like a slow warning I could not yet fully decode. Identity confirmation, unresolved. It was not a phrase used for land or wine or corporate structure. It was a phrase used when someone is no longer certain who the rightful person is. And I remember sitting at the edge of the bed with the paper still in my hand, feeling something I had not felt in years. Not fear, but exposure, like the ground beneath my life had been measured without my permission. The next morning Lauren did not come to breakfast. Instead, a man arrived at the villa gate just after 8, wearing a dark blazer despite the heat, carrying a leather folder that looked older than the rest of him. The staff called him Mr. Caldwell, and when I asked who he was, the house manager hesitated before saying, "He is the legal observer assigned by Hawthorne Capital." I did not like the sound of that phrase, observer, because observers do not participate, they record. And recording in situations like this usually means control without accountability. He entered the terrace with the quiet confidence of someone who had been in rooms like this too many times, and when his eyes met mine, something subtle changed in his expression, not recognition at first, but calculation, as if he was searching a memory file he did not expect to open. Lauren arrived shortly after him, and I noticed immediately that she was different, not emotionally, but structurally, like she had stepped into a version of herself that had been reinforced overnight. "We need to proceed with verification," she said, placing another set of documents on the table. And Mr. Caldwell opened his folder without speaking, spreading papers across the wood like a surgeon preparing instruments. I looked at the pages and said, "You are moving very quickly for something that involves my ownership." And Lauren replied, "That is because ownership is what we are confirming." There was a weight in her voice now that had not been there before, something supported by external authority, and I realized this was no longer just her plan, it was now infrastructure. I turned to Mr. Caldwell and asked, What exactly are you confirming? And he paused longer than necessary before answering. That all parties involved in the transfer are correctly identified under international estate compliance standards. I frowned slightly and said, there is no question about my identity. And for the first time he looked directly at me, really looked, and I saw something shift in his eyes, like recognition breaking through caution. He asked, Ma'am, what year did you first register Collins Vineyards LLC under your primary trust? And I answered without hesitation, because I knew every detail of my own life the way a farmer knows soil. 2009, under Napa County jurisdiction. He nodded slowly, then asked another question. And who co-signed the initial cross-border advisory agreement for European expansion? I felt the air in the room change slightly, because that question was not in the documents in front of me. That question belonged to a layer beneath them, I said. There was no co-signer. And that was when he stopped moving entirely, just for a moment, the way people do when a pattern they expected suddenly breaks. Lauren stepped in immediately. There were updated filings in 2018, she said, sharper now, and I turned to her and replied, show me, not as a challenge, but as a simple request for truth. She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice, and Mr. Caldwell quietly said, that is unusual. And then he did something I did not expect. He stood up from the table and said, I need to verify something with the registry office, and walked away from the terrace, leaving a silence that felt heavier than conversation. Lauren followed him with her eyes, then turned back to me and said, you are making this harder than it needs to be. And I answered, no, I am making it accurate. There was a long pause after that, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind her confidence, not doubt, but instability. Like a structure relying too heavily on something that had just shifted. An hour later, Mr. Caldwell returned, but he was no longer the same person who had left. He placed a printed document on the table and said quietly, there is a discrepancy. Lauren straightened immediately. What kind of discrepancy? She asked. And he looked at me again before answering. The identity associated with the amended trust filings does not match the original certification chain. I did not move, but I felt something inside me become still in a different way, because I understood what that meant before he finished explaining. It meant someone had inserted a version of me into a legal structure that did not originate from me. Lauren's voice tightened. That is not possible, she said. But Mr. Caldwell shook his head slightly and replied, it is not impossible. It is just irregular. And then he added the line that changed the temperature of the entire room, and it usually indicates external influence. Lauren turned to me immediately. What did you do? She said. And I answered softly, I did nothing. And for the first time she looked unsettled, not angry, not controlled, but uncertain, as if the foundation she had been standing on had begun to move beneath her feet. Mr. Caldwell then said something quieter, almost reluctant, there is one more issue. And when he opened the next page, I saw a stamp from a compliance office in California marked, Secondary Identity Validation Requested, and in that moment I understood the shape of what was coming. Because identity was no longer just about ownership. It was about who someone believed I was allowed to be. And as Lauren stared at the document, I saw her confidence begin to fracture in a way she could no longer hide. And the most dangerous realization of all settled between us without anyone speaking it aloud. Someone else had already entered this situation long before Italy, and they had done so using my name in a way I had never authorized. The air after Mr. Caldwell's words did not move the same way anymore, as if the vineyard itself had started listening instead of simply existing. And I remember standing there watching Lauren read the document again and again, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the paper like pressure alone could change what was written on it. She finally looked up at me and said, this is not real. But her voice no longer carried certainty, only resistance, the kind people use when reality stops agreeing with them. Mr. Caldwell did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up his phone and stepped a few feet away, speaking in low tones to someone on the other end. And in that small distance between us, I could feel something shifting, not loudly, not dramatically, but like the slow turning of a locked mechanism that had finally found its missing key. Lauren turned toward me and said, who else have you involved in this? And I answered quietly, I have involved no one beyond what was necessary to protect my own name. And for the first time, she did not interrupt. She just studied me as if I had become unfamiliar terrain. Moments later, Miss Caldwell returned, And the way he held the phone in his hand told me before he even spoke that the conversation he had just finished was not routine. He placed the device on the table and said, "I need to clarify something from the Central Registry in Sacramento." Then he paused, as if choosing his words carefully, and continued, "There is an additional identity marker associated with your name, Mrs. Collins." Lauren immediately straightened. "What does that mean?" she asked. "But Mr. Caldwell did not look at her when he answered. He looked at me, and that alone changed the temperature again. "It means," he said slowly, "that your identity appears in more than one validated federal classification layer." The words did not belong in a Vineyard conversation. They belonged in a world I had spent years trying not to revisit in memory, and I felt something inside me tighten in response. Not fear, but caution. Lauren's voice sharpened. "Federal classification layer for what?" And this time, Mr. Caldwell hesitated longer than before, then said, "That is not fully accessible at this level of authorization." Silence followed, heavy and unnatural, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion but from boundaries being reached. I finally spoke. "There should be nothing attached to my identity that is not public record," and Mr. Caldwell nodded slightly, almost respectfully, before saying, "That is what makes this unusual." He then opened another file, this one marked with a verification stamp that I recognized instinctively even before I read it, because it belonged to systems that only appear when someone's life has once intersected with institutions larger than personal history. Lauren stepped closer to the table and said, "Explain it in simple terms," and Mr. Caldwell finally obliged. "In simple terms, someone is validating whether the person currently listed as Margaret Collins is the original authorized holder of multiple past legal and operational records." I felt the words land differently this time, not as accusation, but as exposure, and I asked, "Operational records related to what?" And he answered, "That is still under restricted review." Lauren looked between us, frustration returning now. "This is ridiculous. She is my mother. There is nothing hidden here." And for the first time, Mr. Caldwell shook his head slightly. "With respect, that is exactly what the system is now questioning." I remember the wind shifting across the terrace at that moment, moving through the vines beyond the stone railing, and it felt like the vineyard itself had become aware of something it had not known before. Lauren turned to me again, her tone lower now, less controlled. "What are you not telling me?" she said, and I answered honestly, "I am telling you everything I know." But even as I said it, I understood why she did not believe me. Because belief had already been replaced by verification, and verification had begun to produce answers. I did not fully recognize myself. Mr. Caldwell excused himself again, this time walking a greater distance away, and I could hear fragments of his conversation carried faintly back by the wind. Words like clearance, confirmation, archival mismatch, and each word added another layer of weight to the morning. Lauren sat down slowly, not as someone defeated, but as someone recalculating, and she said, "There is no version of this where you are just a vineyard owner." And I looked at her and replied, "There was always more to me than this vineyard." And that was when I felt it, the first real fracture in her certainty, because she had built her entire strategy on the assumption that I was only what she could see. Mr. Caldwell returned again, but this time he did not sit. He stood at the edge of the table and said, "The registry has requested a secondary confirmation protocol." And I asked, "From who?" And he answered, "From a federal archival authority connected to prior advisory engagements under your legal name history." Lauren immediately reacted, "That is impossible. She has never held anything like that." But Mr. Caldwell raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to indicate caution. "That is what the current records are suggesting, not what anyone assumed." I felt my breath slow as I listened, because now the situation was no longer just about vineyard ownership or investor pressure. It was about something layered beneath my own public identity, something that had been dormant in records long before Lauren ever decided I was a liability. I turned slightly away from the table and looked toward the vineyard rows stretching into the distance, and for a brief moment I felt as if I was seeing my own life from the outside, incomplete, fragmented, stored in places I had not accessed in years. Lauren spoke again, but her voice was different now, quieter, almost uncertain. "If there is something in your past that affects this," she said, "you need to tell me now." And I answered softly, "I do not know what they are finding." And that was the truth, the most dangerous kind of truth. because it meant control no longer belonged to either of us. It belonged to whatever system was now pulling threads I could not see. And as Mr. Caldwell looked at the final page in his hand and said, "We will need direct identity confirmation from an external authority within 48 hours. I realized that what had begun as a family fracture had now expanded into something far larger, because somewhere inside those records was a version of me that Lauren believed she understood, and a version I myself had not been forced to confront in years. I remember the moment the morning changed, not because something loud happened, but because something official arrived. The kind of arrival that does not ask permission. It simply enters your life and redefines the shape of everything you thought you understood." Mr. Caldwell returned to the terrace just after 9. But this time he was not alone. He was followed by a second man carrying a sealed envelope stamped with Federal Registry markings, and the air around Lauren changed instantly. I saw it in the way she straightened, in the way her hand instinctively moved toward the table as if grounding herself. Mr. Caldwell placed the envelope down and said, "We have received preliminary confirmation from the Central Identity Verification Authority." And for a brief moment no one spoke. Not even the vineyard wind seemed to move as freely as before. Lauren was the first to break the silence. "Then this is over," she said quickly, too quickly, like someone trying to close a door before what is inside it can fully enter. But Mr. Caldwell did not nod. Instead, he opened the envelope carefully and said, "It is not over, it is clarified." And that word, clarified, felt heavier than anything else that had been said so far. I watched him read the document slowly, his expression shifting in small, controlled increments, the way professionals react when information does not match expectation. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mrs. Collins, according to federal archival validation, your primary identity record is intact and verified under original issuance." Lauren exhaled sharply. "Of course it is," she said. "But Mr. Caldwell raised a hand slightly. However," he continued, and the word itself changed the atmosphere again, "there is an anomaly." Lauren leaned forward. "What anomaly?" she asked, and he answered, "An attempted secondary identity replication linked to your name was registered within the last 18 months. I felt the words land differently than Lauren did, because she heard accusation, but I heard interference, something external touching my life without my knowledge. I asked calmly, "Replication by whom?" And Mr. Caldwell replied, "That is still under restricted identification review." Lauren suddenly stood up, her chair scraping slightly against the stone floor. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising for the first time since I arrived in Italy. "This is some kind of administrative mistake." And she turned toward me immediately. "You must have signed something you forgot about, or given access to someone." And I looked at her and said quietly, "I do not forget my own legal identity." There was no anger in my voice, only certainty, and that seemed to unsettle her more than confrontation would have. At that moment, Mr. Caldwell's phone rang, and when he answered it, he stepped away again, but this time not far, because whatever he was hearing required no secrecy, only attention. I could hear fragments clearly now, phrases like verified chain, authorization mismatch resolved, and recalibration complete. When he returned, his face had changed again, not in emotion, but in clarity, as if a fog had finally lifted. He placed the document back on the table and said, "The system has completed cross-verification," Lauren immediately asked. And he looked directly at me before answering. "And it confirms that the current legal holder of Collins Vineyards LLC and associated trust structures is fully authorized under uninterrupted ownership lineage." Lauren froze, not in denial this time, but in confusion that had nowhere to go. She said slowly, "That is not possible." And I turned to her and said, "It is not only possible, it is already done." There was a pause after that, and in that pause something in her composure began to shift, not dramatically, but in layers, like a structure losing alignment one section at a time. Mr. Caldwell then added something quieter. "There is also a secondary finding," and I could feel Lauren's attention sharpen again, because secondary findings are where stories either collapse or expand. He continued, "No evidence supports the legitimacy of any attempted transfer or restructuring executed without direct authorization from the primary holder." And Lauren immediately responded, "That was not my decision alone." And for the first time, her voice carried something closer to urgency than control. She turned toward me and said, "You are acting like I did this alone." But I did not. And I asked calmly, Then tell me who was with you. She hesitated, just long enough for me to see the fracture widen, and she said, the investors, the advisory team, everyone agreed this was necessary, and Mr. Caldwell interjected quietly. Agreement does not replace authorization, and that sentence alone shifted the power in the room. Because suddenly this was no longer about family disagreement, it was about procedural legality. Lauren stepped back slightly, her voice now tighter. They told me everything was compliant, she said, and I replied, compliance is not the same as truth. There was a long silence after that, and in that silence I could see something happening inside her. Not remorse yet, but instability. The realization that the structure she had built her certainty on was no longer stable. She looked at me again and said, so what happens now? And I answered, now the truth continues without interruption. Mr. Caldwell nodded once. The matter will proceed to full audit confirmation with legal enforcement review. And for the first time, Lauren turned away. Not from me, but from the table, as if distance might reset reality. She said, this is being manipulated, but her voice no longer carried conviction, only resistance, and I said softly, no, this is being recorded, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because manipulation can be argued, but records cannot. Moments later, a call came through to Mr. Caldwell's device, and when he answered, he listened without speaking for nearly a full minute, then said, confirmed, and hung up. He looked at me and said, there is no longer any dispute regarding ownership or identity validation. Lauren sat down slowly, as if her body had finally accepted information her mind was still rejecting. She whispered, they cannot just change everything. And I looked at her and said, nothing changed today, Lauren. Today is simply the first time you are seeing what was already true. And in that moment, I understood something important, not about the vineyard, not about the investors, but about the nature of truth itself. It does not arrive to convince, it arrives to remain. And as the wind moved through the vines outside the terrace once again, slower now, almost gentle, I realized that the next phase would not be about proving who I was, but about confronting what had already been done in my name, while I was still believing my life was simple. And Lauren, for the first time since this began, did not have a response ready. I remember the moment everything stopped being controlled by intention and started being controlled by consequence, not because I acted, but because the structure around Lauren began to collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. The first sign came as a phone call on Mr. Caldwell's device. He answered and immediately his expression changed, not dramatically, but in a way only people who have spent their lives inside legal systems can recognize. The kind of silence that follows information too large to contain casually. He stepped slightly away, listened, then said only, understood, before ending the call. When he returned to the table, Lauren was already watching him, her posture no longer confident, but alert in a way that comes before impact. She asked, what now? And he replied carefully, the investor group has initiated an emergency review of their position. The words did not land immediately, but when they did so in layers, like water seeping into cracks already forming beneath the surface. Lauren turned quickly. That is not possible. They committed in writing, and for the first time I saw hesitation replace certainty in her voice. Mr. Caldwell placed both hands on the table and said, commitment does not override compliance findings. And then he added, and compliance findings are now active across all linked accounts. That was the moment the vineyard stopped being a private matter and became a system-wide concern. Another call came, this time on Lauren's phone. She answered immediately, and I watched her expression shift as she listened, the kind of shift that does not happen in stages but in fractures. What do you mean pulling out? She said, her voice rising slightly, then pausing, then tightening again. No, that is not what we agreed. She turned away from the table as if distance could stabilize the conversation. But whatever she was hearing followed her, not physically, but structurally. She came back slowly and said, the investors are withdrawing, not as a statement, but as something she was still trying to disprove while speaking it. Mr. Caldwell nodded once. That is consistent with the compliance advisory issued 30 minutes ago. And Lauren looked at him sharply. You knew this would happen, she said. And he answered simply, I knew what the system required, not how people would react to it. There was a pause after that, a heavy one, and then the second layer of collapse began, because in moments like this people do not unite. They separate. Lauren turned toward the investor representative who had returned to the terrace, his expression no longer neutral but tense. "You said this was clean," she said. And he immediately responded, "We said it was structured, not clean." And in that distinction I saw the first real fracture of loyalty. Voices began to overlap, not shouting, but sharper, faster. The way controlled environments break down when control is no longer shared. "This is your responsibility," Lauren said to him. And he replied quickly, "No, it is your signature chain that triggered the flag." She turned toward Mr. Caldwell. "And you," she said, "you validated this knowing it would collapse everything." And he responded without emotion, "I validated discrepancies. I did not execute decisions." I stood slightly apart from them, watching not as a participant but as the point around which everything else was reorganizing itself, because none of them were speaking to me anymore. They were speaking around me, as if I had already become fixed in place. Lauren's voice rose again, but now it carried something closer to panic than control. "This vineyard cannot survive without that capital," and the investor immediately replied, "Then it was never stable to begin with." And that sentence broke something fundamental in her composure. She turned toward me suddenly, as if remembering I was still the origin of all of this, and said, "This is what you wanted." And I answered calmly, "I did not want anything that required rewriting truth to exist." There was a silence after that, but it was not the same silence as before. This one was empty of alignment, and in that emptiness I watched Lauren begin to lose coordination between what she believed and what was happening. She said, almost to herself, "They promised me control," and the investor responded immediately, "We promised structure, not immunity." And then the lawyer who had been silently reviewing documents stepped forward for the first time, speaking directly to Lauren. "Your authorization pathway is the source of the discrepancy," and she turned on him instantly. "You prepared the documents," she said, and he replied, "I prepared options, not misrepresentation." And in that exchange I saw the final stage of breakdown begin, because when alliances collapse, they do not collapse toward truth. They collapse toward blame. Lauren stepped back and said, "Everyone here is shifting responsibility." And Mr. Caldwell finally spoke again. "Responsibility does not shift, it is assigned by record." And that sentence seemed to end something inside her temporarily, not emotionally, but structurally, like a system losing its last reference point. The investor checked his phone again and said, "All funding channels are frozen pending legal verification," and Lauren whispered, "Frozen," as if the word itself was unfamiliar in this context. Then she laughed once, but it was not humor, it was disbelief trying to protect itself. "You are all overreacting," she said. But no one responded to that, because overreaction requires shared reality, and shared reality had already dissolved. I stepped slightly closer to the table for the first time in hours and said quietly, "This is not collapse, this is correction." Lauren looked at me sharply. "Do not speak like you are outside of this." And I answered, "I am not outside of it. I am simply not changing with it." That was when she finally turned fully toward me, and for the first time I saw something beneath her frustration, not anger, but isolation, because everyone she had relied on was now contradicting each other. The investor was speaking to his phone again. The lawyer was reviewing legal notes rapidly. Mr. Caldwell was no longer intervening, only observing, and Lauren stood in the center of it all, realizing that every system she had activated was now responding in directions she could not control. She said one final time, quieter now, "You did something?" And I shook my head gently and replied, "No, Lauren, I did not do anything. I simply existed in the system you chose to activate." And in that moment the final fracture occurred, not between us, but between her and everyone else in the room, because the investors began discussing liability without her. The lawyer began speaking directly to Mr. Caldwell, and Mr. Caldwell began documenting responses instead of participating in them, and Lauren stood completely still, watching a structure she had helped build reorganize itself without her consent. And for the first time since this began, she was no longer in control of the narrative she thought she was leading. I remember the moment the noise finally stopped feeling important, not because the world became quiet, but because I stopped needing it to make sense of me. The terrace in Napa was different when I returned, not physically at first, but emotionally, as if the air itself no longer expected me to fight it. Lauren was no longer speaking, the investors were no longer negotiating, and Mr. Caldwell had already closed his folder, As if the story had reached a point where documentation mattered more than conversation, I stood there watching all of them slowly detach from the version of events they had been trying to control, and for the first time in days I did not feel pulled into any direction, not forward, not backward, just present. Lauren finally broke the silence, but not with accusation this time, only exhaustion. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. And no one rushed to answer her, because there was nothing left to argue against. Mr. Caldwell spoke first, his voice lower now, almost procedural. "Now the filings proceed through correction protocol," and one of the investors immediately responded, "We are exiting all positions effective today." Not directed at anyone, just spoken into the air like a decision that had already been made elsewhere. Lauren looked at him sharply. "You cannot just walk away," she said. But he avoided her gaze and replied, "We are not walking away. We are responding to risk exposure." And that distinction landed heavier than anything else that morning. I watched her realize that the structure she had relied on was not loyalty-based. It was conditional, and conditions had just changed. She turned to me again, but this time there was no strategy in her eyes, only something closer to confusion. "Everything was supposed to be secure," she said. And I answered softly. Security was never the same as truth. There was a long pause after that, the kind that does not demand response, only acceptance if it comes, and in that pause I felt something inside me loosen. Not victory, not satisfaction, just release. "Mr. Caldwell gathered his documents and said, 'My role here is complete.' Then he looked at me briefly and added, 'Your identity confirmation is fully restored in all systems,' as if speaking about something that had never truly been in question, and I nodded once, not because I needed to, but because I understood that closure in systems rarely feels like closure in life. It feels like paperwork ending while emotions continue elsewhere. After he left, the investors followed in quiet succession, each one offering no apology, no explanation, only distance, until only Lauren and I remained on the terrace, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The vineyard below us stretching out in rows that had seen seasons come and go without concern for human conflict. Lauren finally sat down slowly at the edge of the table, her hands resting flat, no longer controlling anything. And she said something I did not expect. "I thought I was protecting everything." Her voice was lower now, stripped of certainty, and I looked at her for a long time before answering. "Protection and control are not the same thing." She nodded slightly, but I could see she was not fully hearing me yet, because understanding does not arrive at the same speed for everyone. Later that afternoon, the legal representatives confirmed that all transactions initiated under disputed authorization were being suspended pending full review, but the words no longer carried weight for me. They were just mechanisms doing their job. Lucas Reed arrived from Napa by evening, and when I saw him walking across the gravel path toward the villa, something in me finally felt anchored again, not to conflict, but to familiarity. He did not ask for explanations. He simply said, "I assumed this would resolve itself in layers," and I replied, "It already has." And for the first time I believed it. We walked through the vineyard rows as the sun began to lower, and I noticed things I had not allowed myself to notice before. The way the vines responded to wind without resistance, the way the soil held light without asking for recognition. Lucas spoke quietly beside me. "You know this will take time to normalize legally," and I said, "I am not concerned with speed anymore." And that surprised even me when I said it out loud, because for so long everything had been urgency, negotiation, correction, defense, but now none of those words felt relevant. When we reached the lower section of the vineyard, I saw Peter, my longtime estate manager, waiting near the equipment shed. He had been silent through most of the conflict, observing rather than participating, and when he saw me he simply nodded, as if nothing about me had changed in his understanding. "Everything's still standing," he said, half question, half reassurance, and I answered, "Everything that matters." And that was enough. That evening I returned to the villa alone, and for the first time in days I did not check documents, did not listen for phone calls, did not anticipate another correction to reality. Instead, I sat by the window and looked out at the vineyard under fading light. And I thought about what it means to be removed from a battle you did not ask for. Not as a loss, but as a return to something simpler. Lauren came to the doorway later, not entering fully, just standing there as if unsure whether she belonged in the same space as me anymore. She said softly, "What do I do now?" And I answered after a long pause, You learn the difference between building something and controlling it. She nodded once, slowly, and then left without argument, without collapse, just leaving, and I realized that sometimes the most meaningful change is not reconciliation or victory, but distance that allows clarity to form. In the days that followed, the vineyard returned to its rhythm, workers tending rows, light moving across hills, paperwork resolving itself in administrative channels far removed from emotion, and I began to understand that my life had not been taken back. It had simply been returned to its original shape, one that did not require constant defense. I started walking the vineyard every morning without urgency, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lucas, sometimes with Peter, and slowly I felt something I had not felt in years settle into place. Not happiness exactly, but steadiness, the kind that does not need to be announced, only lived. And one afternoon, as I stood between the vines with a glass of wine in my hand, I realized that legacy was never about control over what you leave behind. It was about whether what you built can continue without you holding it tightly. And in that quiet understanding, I finally stopped looking for what had been taken and started noticing what had never left. I did not return to Napa as someone who had won. I returned as someone who finally understood what nothing more needed to be proven felt like. The vineyard looked the same when I stepped out of the car, the same rows stretching into the distance, the same slow movement of wind through vines that had outlived every argument I had ever been forced to have, but I was no longer the same person walking through them. Lucas met me near the entrance that morning, not with urgency, not with celebration, but with a calm nod that said everything had already settled into its final legal shape. "It is finished on paper," he said quietly, and I replied, "Then let it be finished everywhere else too." Because for the first time I understood that closure is not something you force, it is something that arrives when you stop resisting reality. Lauren was not at the vineyard when I arrived, and that absence was not emptiness, it was consequence. I later learned she had stepped back from all advisory involvement, not because she was pushed, but because every system she had depended on had quietly closed around her decisions and required her to face them without the structure she once relied on. Investors had withdrawn entirely, not in anger, but in risk recalibration. Lawyers had moved into review phases, and what remained was not destruction, but redistribution of responsibility. Mr. Caldwell sent a final confirmation report that same afternoon, stating that all identity verification conflicts had been resolved under official registry alignment. And I remember reading those words without emotion, not because I did not feel, but because I no longer needed validation from systems that had already done their job. Peter met me near the equipment shed later that day, and for the first time in a long time he smiled slightly. "Quiet again," he said, and I nodded. "It should have always been quiet," I answered, and we stood there for a moment listening to the vineyard as it returned to itself, not as a battlefield, but as a living place that never asked for anything more than care. Lauren called me 3 days later, not from anger, not from control, but from a place I barely recognized, uncertainty softened by distance. "I did not know where things would end up," she said. And I believed her, because truth in the end does not require agreement, only recognition, I told her. "I do not need you to understand everything, only to understand that I am still here." There was a long pause on the line, and then she said something quieter. "I think I forgot that you were always here before all of this." And I answered, "I never left. I only stopped being seen." After that, we did not try to rebuild anything quickly, because some things are not rebuilt, they are redefined, and time does that better than conversation ever can. In the weeks that followed, I began walking the vineyard every morning, not to check anything, not to fix anything, but simply to exist within it without pressure. Lucas continued handling the remaining legal transitions, but even those began to fade into background noise, paperwork resolving itself without pulling me into its tension. And slowly I noticed something I had not felt in years. Not relief, not victory, but alignment, the kind that comes when your life stops contradicting itself. One afternoon I sat beneath the old oak tree near the southern rows and watched workers move quietly through the vines, and I realized that legacy is not what survives conflict. Legacy is what survives without needing conflict at all. Lauren eventually stepped away completely from any claim to operational direction, not in collapse, but in distance, choosing time instead of tension, and I did not interpret it as loss or punishment, only as the natural outcome of a path that had separated too far to walk together. There were no final confrontations, No dramatic exchanges. Only the slow settling of reality into its correct shape. And in that settling I found something I had not expected. Peace that did not require explanation. I began meeting with Peter more often, not about business, but about soil, weather, seasons, things that do not negotiate, things that simply are. And in those conversations I rediscovered a part of myself that had been buried under years of managing everything except my own stillness. Lucas once said to me, "You handled this differently than most people would." And I told him, I did not handle it. I simply stopped trying to control what was already moving. And he nodded like that answer made more sense than any legal document ever could. One evening, as the sun lowered over Napa and the rows of vines turned gold under fading light, I stood with a glass of wine in my hand, not as a symbol of ownership, but as a reminder of presence, and I thought about how easily people mistake control for love, and possession for safety, and urgency for meaning. But none of those things last unless they are built on something quieter, something honest, something willing to stand even when no one is watching. I want to say something to you who are listening now, not as instruction, but as understanding. There are moments in life when you will feel replaced, misunderstood, or quietly pushed out of places you once called yours. And in those moments, you will want to explain yourself endlessly, but sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain steady long enough for truth to surface on its own. Not every battle requires your voice. And not every silence means you have disappeared. Sometimes it means you have finally stopped breaking yourself to remain visible. If this story has stayed with you in any way, I want to thank you for giving it your time. Because stories like this are not about Vineyard, or law, or inheritance. They are about recognition, about the quiet realization that your worth does not increase or decrease based on who understands you at any given moment. It simply exists, steady and unchanged. And I hope wherever you are right now, you remember that you are allowed to choose peace without earning it. You are allowed to step away from what keeps asking you to shrink. And you are allowed to exist without permission. If you feel this story spoke to something inside you, you can support the channel with a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, not because it is required, but because connection matters more than silence. The core lesson of this story is simple. Self-respect is not something you negotiate. It is something you return to, slowly, honestly, and without apology. There are more stories waiting here, stories of return, of truth, of quiet transformation that do not always end in noise. And I invite you to stay with them, to watch them unfold in their own time, because sometimes the next story is the one that helps you understand your own. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I hope you find what feels like home again in unexpected places. Thank you for listening to this story.